Less than a year ago, establishment support for Ukraine was so high that Zelensky received a warm welcome at the Grammys. Cut to the present, the U.S. has now suspended military aid to Ukraine. Here's John Kirby making that announcement.
Updates on military assistance to Ukraine? I mean, has the well really run dry here, or what does it look like?
We have issued the last drawdown package that we had funding to support, and that's why it's critical that Congress move on that national security supplemental request and we get more funding. The assistance that we provided has now ground to a halt. The attacks that the Russians are conducting are only increasing. And now, as I talked about earlier this week, they're using North Korean ballistic missiles to do their dirty work. So the need is acute right now, particularly in these winter months.
Ukraine will likely not receive any more funding unless Congress passes a new spending package. The deal is seemingly contingent on some sort of compromise on Republican demands regarding the southern border. So far, the U.S. has directed more than $75 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian support to Ukraine.
Concerns about Ukraine aren't just financially focused. The recent death of Gonzalo Lira in a Ukrainian jail cell has raised questions about the state of civil liberties in the country. Lira was a Chilean-American filmmaker and blogger who was arrested after distributing what the Ukrainian government described as pro-Kremlin propaganda. Now, his father claims he was being abused in prison and that he would likely die there if nothing was done to free him. Here's Lira's last public statement to that effect.
The genesis of this whole situation is because I had an opinion that went against the narrative. And that's why I went to prison. And that's why, if I'm arrested again, I will die in prison. So I ask you, please, as many people as possible, the American State Department knows exactly who I am and the situation I'm currently involved in. And they know the fate that awaits me.
Now, friend of the show, Glenn Greenwald, weighed in saying neither Biden nor his top officials ever once uttered a word about Gonzalo Lira, despite his being an American imprisoned by Ukraine for speaking out, and despite the most unhinged Ukrainians threatening Lira's life. That signaled to Ukraine that they could do anything to him. Again, that's from Glenn Greenwald. So here we are at a point where there is no more aid money for Ukraine. Now, that's not for lack of trying on the administration's part. Right now, Zelensky is at Davos for the World Economic Forum meeting. Our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is there as well and said, according to the AP, that he's determined to keep supporting Ukraine. We're working very closely with Congress in order to do that. So the Biden administration would certainly like to send more money to Ukraine. Certain Republican leaders like Mitch McConnell would as well. But it is not for certain right now because there is an appetite to hold out. There's an exhaustion with this funding of the Ukrainian war effort, which has not brought Ukraine any closer to prevailing over Russia. The time for negotiations and peace talks is now. It was yesterday. It was the week and the months before that as well. But here we are.
Yeah, we're now getting an admission, acknowledgement that there were an opportunity to settle this conflict about a month out from Russia's invasion, and that now Ukraine is actually in a less good negotiating position because now it has lost, 500,000 people or so have died in this conflict. They are in the middle of this winter. They're not enjoying the broad, both financial and kind of philosophical support from the world. It does seem like America is now distracted by its new shiny war in the Middle East and is being left against the by the wayside. And of course, you do have the small departure from the bipartisan blob consensus on wanting to fund the war in Ukraine and any other proxy war to, quote unquote, weaken Russia or weaken America's perceived economic enemies. But for the obstruction that the Freedom Caucus presented and the tumult that we saw around the speakership vote over the course of this year, I don't know that there would be as much resistance to the idea of continuing the multi-billion dollars of aid packages that have been going out of the door for the last 2 years now. Now,
yeah, each of those votes were so perfunctory. We're so, well, of course we're going to offer more money, on and on and on.
Right. Now, to this question of this freedom of speech and the journalist who has now died in jail, I'm really struck by the difference between how Evan Gershkovich has been covered by the liberal media at the Correspondents' Dinner. There were free Evan buttons. People have been very concerned about that. Wall Street Journal reporter who was arrested in Russia while on a reporting trip, and compare that to how Gonzalo Lira has been treated. Now, obviously, some of this is a credentialism sort of an issue. A Wall Street Journal reporter is seen as much more credible than someone like Lira, who had a more online sort of a career. He was a pickup artist at one point. He, I think, was more known in kind of alternative right online spaces. That being said, the stated reason for his arrest in Ukraine was, anti-Ukraine propaganda. He was arguing that there was some precedence for the invasion of Russia. And again, we've seen in the United States, many people who have simply argued for some historical context here have been called Putin puppets, been told that they're cheering on Russia's invasion, when in fact they're simply saying, well, this is why the invasion happened. It seems like he was doing some of that kind of reporting, and Ukraine accused him of justifying or cheering on Russia's invasion. And in Ukraine, that is not just something that gets you condemned on Twitter, it's something that can get you thrown in jail and dead.
Yeah, I think that's very fair to point out, and it's not, from my point of view, to discourage or diminish the support for Evan Gershkovich, who's being wholly unjustly held by Russia. Absolutely an attack on the free press and on free speech. But what we see time and time again from mainstream media is it's so selective who benefits from that sympathy. And he deserves it. Absolutely, there's no question he deserves it. But does someone like Julian Assange get that level of support and validation? It's a credentialism thing. The media is reluctant to recognize victims of censorship, imprisonment, due process violations when it's not in there, when it's someone who's estranged from their club. Yeah. And that's exactly what's going on here. Again, it makes you think, what's actually at stake? Is this a conflict between? Are we defending the West and Western values and the Enlightenment when a country, Ukraine, and its government has suspended opposition parties, has suspended alternative media, has jailed dissenters? That makes it. That puts us to, well, what are we actually fighting here? What are we fighting to defend if our supposed ally is having to result to behavior that we condemn in Russia? We condemn when it's China. We condemn when it's this geopolitical rival. And I think it makes the whole project very philosophically fraught, because what's actually at stake is not those values, but territory that Russia and Ukraine contest, where the underlying people have some Ukrainian loyalty, but also a lot of Russian loyalty, and should probably have some say in which country they're a part of. It's not a conflict of visions or of global power. It's a dispute over territory.
Well, I would say that it's not just about the territory. It's about the territory was a proxy battle for economic dominance on the global stage. There's a reason that we're fighting with Russia, and that we had domino theory in the middle part of the last century, and we had we were all inculcated with the idea that it was America's duty and right to go to war to defeat communism, to force other countries to adopt our own economic worldview. And you don't have to personally like and support communism to be able to see that we would certainly bristle at the idea that another power felt entitled to use military force to undermine what we have decided democratically in our country is the way that we'd like to run our government. And so remember that preceding this conflict, and this is the kind of reporting that I suspect that Lira got in trouble for, that there was a dispute as to whether or not the disputed regions in the East were going to be allowed to have independent vote about whether or not they wanted to accept a kind of Western IMF model controlling the country, or take a package, an economic deal and package that was being offered by Russia. And the concern was that if democratic vote elections were allowed, that Russia was the likely choice. And does America allow its own economic dominance to falter if people are openly choosing an alternative? But I think your broader point is completely right. I mean, this is a country that the law under which he was thrown in jail is Article 46-2 of the country's criminal code, which prevents, quote, justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine. You can be thrown in jail for the crime of having a political opinion that is characterized as, quote, justifying Russian aggression against Ukraine. I can't think of anything less in line with our own free speech values and interest than that. And it will be very interesting to see if any Biden officials are forced to weigh in on the death of this particular American citizen abroad.
Yeah, and it will be very interesting to continue to follow the funding issue. Will there be more support for Ukraine if Republicans are able to get their way on the southern border? It'll be very interesting to see. More Rising right after this.